This is the 8th and final episode of the life story of Charles Haswell Campagnac, and in it we're going to deal with the last chapter in his autobiography, which is entitled The Sad Plight of the Anglo Burman Community. It starts. It is difficult to give a connected account of the ordeal which Anglo Burmans underwent as a result of the Japanese invasion of Burma. No plan was drawn up as to what they were to do in the event of Rangoon falling into enemy hands. I was told that a favoured few were provided with passages on one of the steamers which had brought troops to Rangoon and was returning empty to India. Most Anglo-Burmans, including myself, were only told of this after the steamer had sailed, and we were informed that a number of Jews had travelled on this steamer, taking with them their household furniture and belongings. Personally, I would not have left Rangoon at this time because I felt it to be my duty to remain with my people and to do whatever I could for them. But I would have tried to get berths for my wife and 2 children on the steamer. The majority of Anglo-Burmans resided in the centre of Rangoon, but after 23rd December 1941, when the city was first bombed, the majority of them left their flats and houses for the suburbs. Several families took up their abode in my house, and others camped in my compound. After every air raid by the Japanese bombers, I used to tour the suburbs in my car, visiting as many families as I could. The courage of these people was marvellous. There was no panic, although in many houses I found women kneeling in prayer, Roman Catholics counting their beads, side by side with Anglicans and Baptists and Christians of other denominations, and with Buddhists praying that the lives of their children might be spared. The children were all cheerful, in spite of being huddled together in narrow trenches and not having very much to eat. I used to call out to them, "Are you downhearted?" And there would be a ringing response of, "No." And I would say, "Thumbs up." And all the little thumbs would be raised. Afterwards, I would start singing them some of the old songs. Pick up your troubles in your old kit bag. Show me the way to go home. Keep the home fires burning. There'll always be an England, and so on. The husbands, fathers, and elder brothers of these people were either in the army or doing work in the essential services, post and telegraph, at the water pumping and sewage stations, at the wireless stations, in the police and the railway. Nearly all the Indian and Burman employees of the railway had deserted, but the Anglo-Burmans kept the trains running up to the last. Women and girls remained at their posts in the War Office and telephone exchange up to D-Day. Some of the girls lost their lives while travelling in the last train to Mandalay when they alighted at Taungoo station to buy something at the roadside eating stalls. As they stepped onto the platform, Japanese planes flew low and killed them with shots from machine guns. Among these girls was a great friend of ours, Frida Ford, and I heard of her death almost immediately as I was driving through Taungoo in an army lorry at the time. Nurses and St John's ambulance workers ministered to the wants of British soldiers and kept coffee stalls open for them throughout the day and night. The Lady June Hobson, head of St John's Ambulance, remained in Rangoon up to the last moment and only left when she was made to do so. She was the last Englishwoman in Rangoon, as all the others had been evacuated by steamer long before D-Day. When I was in India, I received a letter from Lady June speaking in high praise of the heroic work done by these girls and telling me that it had not been for them, there would have been no nurses to tend to the wounded soldiers in Rangoon or to fly them out to India. All the Englishwomen in Rangoon were secretly evacuated by steamer. I only came to hear of this as living in a house in the next compound to mine were a young Englishman and his wife. The Englishman had, as had all English civilians, been conscripted He told me that he was nervous at having to leave his wife alone in the house and asked me if I could afford her some protection. I arranged for some Burmese young bloods to sleep in his compound. Early one morning, they woke me up to tell me that the Dakinma, the Englishman's wife, had left in a bus in which there were a number of other English ladies, and that the driver of the bus had informed them that all the ladies were leaving Rangoon by steamer that night. When I saw my neighbour the next day, he confirmed what I'd been told. I told him that I expected he would be the next to vanish. He assured me that he would remain to the last and that we would both leave Rangoon together. A day or two later, my neighbour's chauffeur informed me that his master had gone to India to purchase lorries for the army. I took him to the end of the compound and pointed out that University Avenue, as far as one could see, was lined with army lorries, which were stranded as no drivers could be found. He asked me what he was to do. I advised him to load as much of his master's furniture as he could onto his master's car and take it to his village, which was near Tharawadi, about 70 miles from Rangoon. The chauffeur made several trips backwards and forwards to this village until he had removed all the furniture from the house. By this time, I could see the writing on the wall, and I advised Anglo Burman families in Rangoon to try and find their way to Mandalay. It was a great wrench for these people to leave their homes. Their standard of living had been high. Almost all of them had resided in well-furnished flats or houses in which there were pianos, radio sets, and gramophones. Many of them owned motor cars. In the scramble to get away, and because of the lack of transport, they had to abandon all their worldly possessions except bundles of clothes which they could carry with them. Out of a total population of 20,000 Anglo Burmans, at least 5,000 civilians died as a result of the war. Many of them were killed by enemy action during the bombing of Rangoon and Mandalay. Thousands of them died of starvation and exhaustion during the 300-mile trek through Ukong Valley to India. They had to cross swollen rivers and climb high mountains and find their way through jungles and through territories over which no human feet had ever trod. Often their only guides were the corpses they saw by the wayside of people who had gone before them. Across some rivers, the only bridges were ropes tied to trees, along which they had to pull themselves hand over hand. I was told that one family, the Lahis, father and mother and 3 grown-up daughters and 2 sons, fell into a torrential river while attempting to cross it this way and were swept away in the flood. Only one son lived to tell the tale. He then deals with Anglo Burmans in India. The Anglo Burmans in India were dispersed to various towns. The younger men and women quickly found occupation. Those who could not work were given a monthly advance, averaging about 50 rupees or £3 a head, for which they had to sign promissory notes, although they were told that these amounts would not be recovered from them. After the war, these promissory notes were made over to the Burmese government. If anyone had signed one of these promissory notes, was a government servant, deductions were made from his salary until the advance was repaid. While in India, Anglo-Burmans were told by the government of Burma in exile that they would be compensated for the losses they had sustained through having been compelled to leave their houses and all their possessions in Burma. Accordingly, Anglo-Burmans were asked to submit claims for losses which they had sustained. After the British reoccupied Burma, the British government again asked Anglo-Burmans to submit their claims for losses, but all they received was a postcard acknowledging their claims and advising them to preserve the postcard carefully. The next thing was that Burma was given independence, and the British government said that settlement of these claims was now the responsibility of the Burmese government. It is difficult to understand how the Burmese government can be held responsible to indemnify Anglo-Burmans for losses which they sustained owing to the default of the British government. Under the Government of Burma Act 1935, defence was a reserved subject. The legislature had no say as to how much of the revenues were to be spent on defence. This was the sole responsibility of the government. Income tax was also a reserved subject and was levied for the purpose of providing for the defence of the country. Admittedly, the British government failed to provide for the adequate defence of Burma. The Burmese government said it could not meet the claims for compensation for losses sustained by the Anglo Burman community during the war until it received reparations from Japan. When Japan did begin to meet her obligations, she did not pay reparations in cash, but in kind. After a great deal of agitation in Burma and in Parliament, the British government agreed to pay a maximum of £450 to Anglo Burmans for the loss of their goods and chattels. But the payment was only to be made to Anglo Burmans who came to England and were able to provide documentary proof of their claims. It must be said that a very small percentage of the Anglo Burman community would be able to afford to pay their passages to England, and even if they were able to do so, they would find difficulty in obtaining passports. I do not think that Great Britain can be proud of the way in which she abandoned these people, who were of their own kith and kin and who showed such loyalty and devotion to her cause in the time of her adversity. Owing to Britain's neglect, the Anglo Burman community has ceased to exist. Charles also deals with the release of the Anglo Burmans in Maymyo. My son Raymond was sent by General Rees to Maymyo to find out whether the Japanese were still there. When he arrived at Maymyo, he found that the Japanese had just left and that hundreds of Anglo Burmans were still shut up in a barbed wire camp. The prisoners were overjoyed when they saw Raymond, and they gathered around him and embraced him. One lady, Miss Rodriguez, wrote to me saying that she thought Raymond could never have kissed so many girls in his life. Raymond knew a number of these people personally and was able to inform them about their relatives who had reached India. He made them write letters to their relatives, which he then censored himself and put them in a bag, which he had flown to the rehabilitation department of the government of Burma in exile at Simla. And I think this is about the final piece that I will read, but it's towards the end of that chapter. A few words from Dr. Hugh Tinkler, the historian who wrote The Union of Burma. And apparently what I'm reading is contained at pages 185 to 187. Another community at the crossroads are the Anglo Burmans, who are facing a much more clear-cut dilemma. This community never numbered more than a few thousands, but its contribution to Burma's national development and security has been memorable in the past and is still considerable in the present. Unlike the Anglo-Indians, they have not, through passage of time and possibly the influence of caste, settled down as an indigenous community. Almost all the Anglo-Burmans of today can claim a British grandparent, many a British parent, so that the ties of home are real. The community has, by tradition, looked to government service for employment. The police, the railway, the customs and the telephone departments in particular have found a recruiting ground among the Anglo-Burmans. During the Second World War, when so many loyalties went into the melting pot, the Anglo-Burmans stood firm alongside of their British brothers. Very many made the hideous trek out to India. A high proportion of the men served in the armed forces, and the nursing service of the 14th Army included large numbers of Anglo-Burman sisters. After liberation, most of the community was reabsorbed into government employment. Then came the shock of Burma's departure from the British Commonwealth. Many rapidly decided that they could not fit in to this new Burma and emigrated. In particular, the most enterprising of the young generation left the country, the young men to enlist in the RAF, the girls to become stenotypists in London. Those who were in the government services found themselves, not unnaturally, required to adopt Burmese citizenship. Some hoped quietly to obtain a dual nationality to keep their British passports whilst accepting Burmese citizenship in Burma. An act introduced in the Burma Parliament in 1954 tightened up the regulations. Anglo Burmans were required to make a definite declaration of Burmese citizenship and to renounce their British nationality before the 1st of April 1955, or forfeit their posts in the services and to become subject to the restrictions regulating aliens. A further problem was the announcement of the government's intention to require all candidates for matriculation to take the examination in Burmese. Whilst many Anglo-Burmans, but by no means all, are fluent in spoken Burmese, few have any acquaintance with the written language, and the new ruling would virtually compel the children of the community to merge their cultural identity into that of the nation at large. The need to come to a decision on these two matters has brought the community to a showdown. Many have made the difficult decision to leave their jobs and their dwellings and make the long voyage to the land they have never seen, but have always known as home. And then we come back to a few final words from Charles. Having regard to this background, it is not surprising that the Anglo Burman community considered itself to be a community of Burma, although the fathers and grandfathers of most of them had come from Great Britain. The community had always been loyal to the British, and many of them spoke of England, which the majority of them had never seen as home. But if England was their fatherland, then Burma was their motherland, and they were determined to do all that lay in their power to restore Burma to its former position as a prosperous and beautiful country. If it had been known at Simla that the British were going to get out of India, Anglo-Burmans, or undoubtedly the majority of them, would have realised that their position in a self-governing Burma would be difficult and hazardous. At the time Charles Campagnac wrote this, everyone thought the British would return and stay in Burma. So one can only wonder what he would make of the country today, with all of the ups and mainly downs which it has experienced since the end of the Second World War. This completes the episodes on the life of Charles Haswell Campagnac, and I hope you've enjoyed them. Thank you for listening.